In 1959, 9-year-old Candy Rogers disappeared from a Spokane street while selling Campfire Girl mints, and when her body was discovered 36 hours later in the pine woods near Fort George Wright, it shattered a community's innocence forever. For 62 years, this cold case haunted investigators, tormented her family, and left an entire town wondering if her killer walked among them. Soldiers were questioned, neighbors were suspected, and leads went cold as winter snow. But in 2021, cutting-edge DNA technology and forensic genealogy finally revealed a name that no one saw coming, a trusted serviceman who had been hiding in plain sight all along. When the truth emerged, it didn't just solve a decades-old mystery, it exposed how evil can wear the uniform of honor and how justice, though delayed, refuses to stay buried. The arrest may have shocked the community, but what they discovered about the killer will haunt Spokane forever. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the residential streets of Spokane as 9-year-old Candy Rogers adjusted her Campfire Girl sash and picked up the small cardboard box filled with mint candies. The 6th of March, 1959, felt like any other day in their quiet neighborhood, where children played safely and parents knew every face on the block. Mrs. Rogers watched from the kitchen window as her daughter's bright smile caught the fading light. Candy had been excited all week about her mint sale assignment, practicing her sales pitch and counting the money she hoped to earn for her troop. Her small hand gripped the box handle with determination, her merit badge gleaming on her uniform. "Be back before dark, sweetheart," Mrs. Rogers called from the porch, her breath visible in the crisp air. Candy waved enthusiastically, her pigtails bouncing as she turned toward the sidewalk. She had mapped out her route carefully, 3 blocks of houses where neighbors knew her family. The late winter air nipped at her cheeks, but her excitement kept her warm. The first few houses welcomed her cheerfully. Mrs. Henderson bought 2 boxes and praised her salesmanship. Mr. Thompson at the corner house took 1 box and told her to keep the change from his dollar bill. Each successful sale boosted her confidence, and she mentally calculated how much money she was earning for her campfire group. As daylight began to fade, Candy approached one final house on her route. The porch light wasn't on yet, but she could see warm light glowing from within. She climbed the steps and knocked on the door, her smile ready and her mint box held proudly before her. The door opened, and a man she didn't recognize looked down at her. He wore what appeared to be a military uniform, though she couldn't make out the details in the dim light. Her parents had taught her to respect servicemen, and she launched into her practice sales pitch about Campfire Girl mints supporting community programs. "Come in for a moment," the man said, his voice calm and ordinary. "Let me get my wallet." The streetlights flickered on one by one as evening settled over Spokane, but Candy Rogers had not returned home. Mrs. Rogers stood on her front porch, calling her daughter's name into the growing darkness. The mint sale should have been finished an hour ago. Mr. Rogers joined his wife outside, his work boots heavy on the wooden steps. "She probably lost track of time at the Henderson place," he said, though his voice carried an edge of concern he tried to hide. They walked the 3-block route Candy had planned, knocking on doors and asking neighbors. Mrs. Henderson confirmed Candy had been there early in the afternoon. Mr. Thompson remembered her bright smile and the cheerful way she'd thanked him for the tip. But after that, no one had seen her. As full darkness descended, the couple returned home, hoping to find Candy waiting for them with an explanation and an empty mint box. Instead, they found only the porch light they'd left burning, casting lonely shadows across their empty front steps. Mrs. Rogers's hands trembled as she gripped the porch railing. "She wouldn't just disappear," she whispered. "Not our Candy." Mr. Rogers went inside and stared at the telephone for a long moment before lifting the heavy black receiver. His finger hesitated over the rotary dial. Calling the police would make this real, would admit that something terrible might have happened to their little girl. But as the church bells chimed 9 o'clock and Candy still hadn't come home, he knew he had no choice. With shaking hands, he dialed the number he'd never hoped to need. "Spokane Police Department," came the voice on the other end. "My daughter is missing," Mr. Rogers said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's 9 years old, and she's been gone since this afternoon." Within an hour, Spokane police had established a command post in the Rogers' living room. Detective Frank Keller spread a map of the neighborhood across the coffee table, while uniformed officers took detailed descriptions of Candy and her planned route. "We'll start with the immediate area," Detective Keller explained to the worried parents. "Sometimes children get turned around or lose track of time." But as midnight approached with no sign of Candy, the search expanded. Volunteers from the neighborhood joined police officers, their flashlights creating a constellation of moving lights through the residential streets. They called her name repeatedly, their voices echoing off house walls and through bare tree branches. Word reached nearby Fairchild Air Force Base, and Captain James Porter arrived with 24 servicemen to assist in the search. The military presence brought both comfort and unease to the community. Comfort in their numbers and organization, unease in the implication that this was serious enough to warrant military involvement. The searchers spread out in a grid pattern, moving systematically through backyards, vacant lots, and the wooded areas that bordered the neighborhood. Pine trees towered overhead, their branches blocking moonlight and creating deep pockets of shadow where flashlight beams seemed to disappear. Evelyn Carter, a young mother from 2 blocks away, walked alongside the volunteers. She kept thinking of her own daughter, safe in bed, and couldn't shake the image of Candy's bright smile from their chance encounter just days earlier. "Candy!" the voices called again and again. "Candy Rogers!" The sound carried through the cold March night, mixing with the distant hum of search vehicles and the static of police radios. Every few minutes, someone would stop to listen, hoping to hear a child's voice calling back. As dawn approached, exhaustion began to show on the searchers' faces. Some volunteers had been looking for nearly 8 hours, but none suggested stopping. Detective Keller coordinated with Captain Porter to expand the search grid even further, including the more remote wooded areas near Fort George Wright. The morning light revealed what the darkness had hidden. At 8:30 a.m. on the 8th of March 1959, 2 soldiers searching a wooded ravine near Fort George Wright discovered what every parent in Spokane had been praying they wouldn't find. Candy Rogers lay among the pine needles, her small body partially hidden by fallen branches. Her campfire girl uniform was disheveled, and the clothing that should have protected her from the cold had been used as the instrument of her death. The mint box was nowhere to be found. Sergeant Mike Davis, who made the discovery, immediately called for Detective Keller while his partner secured the scene. Both men had children of their own, and the sight before them would haunt their dreams for years to come. Detective Keller arrived within minutes, followed by the county coroner and a photographer. The scene was carefully documented, every detail preserved as evidence. The location was remote enough that Candy couldn't have wandered there herself, confirming what everyone already feared: this was murder. News of the discovery traveled quickly through the network of searchers and back to the command post. Detective Keller made the difficult walk to the Rogers house, where Candy's parents had maintained their vigil throughout the night. Mrs. Rogers saw his face before he spoke a word. The careful composure she'd maintained for 36 hours crumbled instantly. Her scream seemed to tear through the fabric of the quiet neighborhood, a sound of pure anguish that would echo in the memories of everyone who heard it. Mr. Rogers caught his wife as she collapsed, his own tears falling silently onto her hair. The mint sale that had begun with such innocent excitement had ended in unthinkable tragedy. Captain Porter stood with the police officers, his military bearing unable to mask the profound sadness in his eyes. 4 of his men had found a murdered child, and the questions about military involvement would begin immediately. The Mount Olive Baptist Church overflowed with mourners on the 12th of March 1959. Hundreds of Spokane residents, most of whom had never met Candy Rogers personally, filled every pew and lined the walls to pay their respects to the 9-year-old whose life had been stolen so violently. Reverend Thomas Hale delivered a service that balanced grief with hope, speaking of a child who had brought joy to her family and community. Candy's small white coffin, heartbreakingly dwarfed by the altar arrangements, became the focal point for a community's collective sorrow. Mrs. Rogers, supported by her husband and extended family, placed a small box of Campfire Girl mints on top of the coffin before the service began. The gesture was both tribute and defiance, a declaration that Candy's innocent purpose would not be forgotten, even in death. The congregation sang hymns with voices heavy with emotion. Jesus Loves the Little. Children filled the church with bittersweet melody, while parents held their own children closer, suddenly aware of how fragile safety really was. Detective Keller sat in the back of the church, his notebook closed for once. He studied the faces in the crowd, knowing that statistically, Candy's killer might be among them. The thought made his stomach turn, but it was a reality he couldn't ignore. Members of Candy's campfire troop, dressed in their uniforms, served as honorary pallbearers alongside family members. Their young faces reflected confusion and loss that shouldn't have existed in children so young. At the cemetery, as the small coffin was lowered into the ground, Mrs. Rogers whispered a promise that only she and God could hear. "I will never forget you, sweetheart, and I will never stop looking for who did this to you." The community dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave Candy alone in the cold ground. Many would return regularly over the years, leaving flowers, toys, and small remembrances for the little girl who had become a symbol of innocence lost. The investigation into Candy Rogers' murder began immediately, with Detective Keller establishing an incident room at the Spokane Police Department. A large bulletin board dominated one wall, covered with photographs of the crime scene, maps of the neighborhood, and a growing list of potential suspects. Every serviceman stationed at Fairchild Air Force Base during the relevant time period was interviewed. Captain Porter cooperated fully, providing personnel records and duty rosters, but the process was massive. Hundreds of young men in uniform had to be questioned, their whereabouts on the 6th of March documented and verified. Neighbors underwent similar scrutiny. Detective Keller and his team knocked on every door within a 5-mile radius of where Candy had been found. They compiled lists of anyone who had seen her that afternoon, anyone who had been in the area, anyone who seemed nervous or evasive during questioning. The investigation generated dozens of leads, each one meticulously followed. A drifter seen near the railroad tracks was tracked down and cleared. A neighbor who had seemed too eager to join the search was investigated and eliminated as a suspect. A soldier who had been absent without leave on the 6th of March was located and provided an alibi that checked out. Detective Keller worked 18-hour days, driven by the image of Mrs. Rogers' face when she'd learned of her daughter's death. The case files grew thicker by the week, but concrete leads remained frustratingly elusive. Physical evidence from the scene was limited. The remote location had been exposed to weather for 36 hours before discovery. What evidence existed was carefully preserved, though forensic technology of 1959 offered limited analysis options. The bulletin board became a monument to investigative frustration. Red string connected suspects to locations, timelines, and evidence, but no clear pattern emerged. Detective Keller would stand before it for hours, willing the pieces to form a picture that made sense. After 6 months of intensive investigation, the case remained unsolved, though not inactive. The board stayed up, the files stayed open, and Detective Keller's determination never wavered. The murder of Candy Rogers changed Spokane in ways both visible and hidden. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely now insisted on escorts to school. Front doors that had never needed locks were secured each night. The easy trust that had defined small-town life became a casualty of one man's evil. Evelyn Carter found herself checking on her sleeping daughter multiple times each night, unable to shake the fear that safety was just an illusion. She wasn't alone. Mothers across the city reported similar anxieties, a collective trauma that bonded them in unwanted sisterhood. Children noticed the change too. They weren't allowed to play outside after dark anymore. Their parents' conversations stopped abruptly when they entered the room. The name Candy Rogers became a whispered warning, a cautionary tale that robbed childhood of some of its innocence. The military presence in Spokane, once seen as protection and economic stability, now carried undertones of suspicion. While most residents understood that the actions of one individual couldn't define an entire institution, the association lingered. Some families who had previously welcomed servicemen to their dinner tables became more reserved. Local businesses felt the impact as well. Parents stopped sending children on errands alone. The evening foot traffic that had characterized downtown Spokane dwindled as families hurried home before dark. Even routine activities carried new weight and worry. Detective Keller observed these changes during his continued investigation. The community's fear was palpable, but it also strengthened their resolve. More people called in tips, paid attention to their surroundings, and looked out for each other's children. The woods where Candy had been found became an unofficial memorial site, though few parents allowed their children near it. Still, flowers appeared regularly among the pine trees, left by community members who refused to let her memory fade. Winter arrived early in 1959, blanketing Spokane in snow that seemed to muffle more than just sound, it muffled hope. 6 months after Candy Rogers' murder, the case had generated hundreds of interviews, dozens of potential suspects, and thousands of man-hours of investigation, but no arrest. Detective Keller found himself returning to the evidence room regularly, reviewing the carefully cataloged items from the crime scene. Candy's clothing, preserved in sealed bags, served as a constant reminder of what had been done to an innocent child. The forensic analysis had revealed little that advanced the investigation, limited by the technology available in 1959. The Rogers family struggled to establish a new normal. Mrs. Rogers had returned to work, but her colleagues noticed she seemed to listen for something that never came. Perhaps the sound of small feet running up the front steps, or a voice calling, "Mom, I'm home." Mr. Rogers threw himself into overtime hours, as if staying busy could keep the grief at bay. Candy's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it on the 6th of March. Her stuffed animals sat on the bed, her school books stacked on her desk, her Campfire Girl handbook open to the page she'd been reading about community service. Mrs. Rogers dusted the room weekly but changed nothing. The dinner table setting had become a painful ritual. For months, Mrs. Rogers had automatically set a place for Candy, her muscle memory stronger than her logical mind. Each evening, when she realized her mistake, she would quietly remove the extra plate and silverware, tears falling silently onto the tablecloth. Detective Keller visited the family regularly, updating them on the investigation's progress. These meetings grew increasingly difficult as weeks passed without breakthrough. The promise to find Candy's killer felt more fragile with each update that began with, "We're still working on it." The 1,960 seconds brought social change and urban growth to Spokane, but in the police department's evidence room, time stood still. Box after box of case files accumulated as new crimes demanded attention, but Candy Rogers' murder file remained accessible, a testament to Detective Keller's refusal to let it disappear into bureaucratic obscurity. Detective Keller retired in 1967, but not before personally briefing his replacement, Detective Jim Morrison, on every detail of the Rogers case. The handoff took place over several afternoons, with Keller walking Morrison through each piece of evidence, every interview, and all the dead-end leads that had consumed 8 years of his career. "Don't let this case die," Keller told Morrison as they stood before the familiar bulletin board. "That little girl deserves justice, and her mother deserves answers." Morrison inherited not just the case files, but the weight of community expectation. Spokane residents still asked about progress on the Rogers murder. Mrs. Rogers still called the police department monthly, hoping for news. The case had become part of the city's identity, an open wound that refused to heal. New investigative techniques emerged throughout the decade, improved fingerprint analysis, better crime scene photography, enhanced interview protocols, but none provided the breakthrough that would solve Candy's murder. Morrison applied these new methods to the old evidence, but the passage of time had degraded both physical evidence and witness memories. Young officers joining the force learned about the Rogers case during their orientation. It served as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration to never give up on seeking justice, and warning about the personal cost of carrying unsolved cases. Several officers requested assignment to the case over the years, bringing fresh eyes and energy, but the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. The archive files grew to fill multiple boxes, documenting every lead pursued, every suspect investigated, every scientific test performed. Each box represented thousands of hours of work, hundreds of interviews, and the persistent hope that the next piece of information would be the key that unlocked the mystery. Every the 6th of March, Mrs. Rogers made the solitary journey to Mount Olive Cemetery, carrying a small box of campfire girl mints. The ritual had begun spontaneously the first anniversary of Candy's death and had continued without interruption for more than a decade. The cemetery groundskeepers recognized her approach, the slow, measured walk of someone carrying both flowers and memories. They ensured Candy's gravesite was always well maintained, understanding without words that this mother's annual pilgrimage was sacred ground for the entire community. Mrs. Rogers would kneel beside the headstone, her arthritic knees protesting more each year, and place the mint box carefully among whatever flowers she had brought. She would then spend an hour in quiet conversation with her daughter, updating her on family news, community changes, and the ongoing search for justice. "Detective Morrison is still working on your case, sweetheart," she would whisper. "He's a good man, just like Detective Keller was. They haven't forgotten you. None of us have forgotten you." The conversations covered the mundane details of life. Candy would never experience how her father had been promoted at work, how the neighborhood had changed, how other children in the family were growing up. Mrs. Rogers shared these details as if Candy could somehow participate in the life that had been stolen from her. Other visitors occasionally joined the memorial ritual. Evelyn Carter often accompanied Mrs. Rogers, bringing her own flowers and sharing memories of Candy's bright smile. Former members of Candy's campfire troupe, now grown women with children of their own, would sometimes appear, their presence a bridge between the innocence that had died with Candy and the complicated adulthood that survived her. The mint boxes accumulated throughout the year, joined by small toys, handwritten notes, and seasonal decorations left by community members who refused to let Candy's memory fade. The cemetery became an unofficial shrine to childhood innocence lost, a place where Spokane's collective grief could find expression. Detective Morrison sometimes found Mrs. Rogers at the cemetery, recognizing that her vigil was as important to the case as any investigation. Her unwavering devotion kept Candy's story alive in the community consciousness, ensuring that someone, somewhere, might eventually remember the crucial detail that would solve the mystery. As the 1,970 seconds transformed America's social landscape, Spokane embraced growth and modernization, but Candy Rogers' story became an increasingly distant memory for all but those most directly affected. New residents arrived who had never heard her name. Young families moved into neighborhoods where her tragedy was no longer common knowledge. The physical reminders of her case gradually faded. Detective Morrison transferred to another department in 1974, passing Candy's files to Detective Patricia Wells. The bulletin board that had dominated the incident room for 15 years was finally dismantled, its photographs and maps archived in the growing collection of case boxes. Mr. Rogers aged visibly during this period, his hair turning white and his step becoming slower. The photograph of Candy on their living room mantel began to fade despite Mrs. Rogers' careful protection from direct sunlight. Time, it seemed, was determined to erase all traces of their daughter, making her parents' determination to remember even more precious. The Rogers family had grown smaller and quieter. Extended family members had passed away or moved to other cities. Holiday gatherings that once included dozens of relatives now consisted of just Mr. and Mrs. Rogers and a handful of cousins. Candy's absence had become a permanent presence at these gatherings, acknowledged in the prayers and remembered in the empty chair that was no longer set at the table. New crimes demanded attention from the Spokane Police Department. Detective Wells inherited not just Candy's case, but dozens of other cold files that represented the unsolved mysteries of a growing city. She dedicated time to reviewing old cases, but resources were limited, and active cases took priority. Still, the Rogers case retained a special status. Community members continued to call with tips, though most proved unrelated to Candy's murder. Mrs. Rogers' monthly calls to the police department became shorter and more routine, but they never stopped. Her voice on the telephone served as a reminder that for some people, time had stopped on the 6th of March 1959. The woods where Candy had been found became the site of new development as Spokane expanded. A small park was established nearby, though few visitors knew of its connection to the city's most famous unsolved murder. The 1,980 seconds brought revolutionary advances in forensic science, and Detective Wells saw an opportunity to apply new techniques to old mysteries. DNA analysis was beginning to transform criminal investigation, offering the possibility of identifying perpetrators from biological evidence that had been useless under previous technology. In 1987, Detective Wells carefully retrieved the evidence boxes from Candy Rogers' case, hoping that 18 years in storage had preserved enough material for the new scientific methods. The clothing used to strangle Candy had been meticulously preserved, sealed in evidence bags that protected it from contamination and degradation. The Washington State Crime Laboratory had recently acquired DNA testing capabilities, and Detective Wells submitted samples from Candy's case for analysis. The process was expensive and time-consuming, but the potential breakthrough justified the resource allocation. For the first time since 1959, investigators had reason for genuine optimism. The initial results were promising. Sufficient biological material existed to develop a DNA profile of Candy's attacker. The profile was entered into the newly established state DNA database, where it could be compared against samples from convicted criminals and other unsolved cases. Detective Wells called Mrs. Rogers with the news, the first genuinely hopeful update she had received in nearly 3 decades. "We have his DNA?" Wells explained. "If he's committed any crime anywhere in the state since this database started, we'll find him." Mrs. Rogers wept at the news, a mixture of hope and exhaustion overwhelming her. At 71, she had begun to fear she might die without ever knowing who had killed her daughter. The possibility of scientific justice renewed her faith in ways that years of traditional investigation had not. The DNA profile was pristine and complete, providing investigators with a genetic fingerprint that would identify Candy's killer with absolute certainty if they could find him. The profile joined thousands of others in the database, waiting for the match that would finally bring justice. Detective Wells updated the case file with the new information, attaching the DNA analysis report to decades of investigation records. The profile represented the most significant breakthrough in the case since Candy's body had been discovered, but it was still just a tool waiting for the right comparison. The 1,990 seconds saw further expansion of DNA databases, both state and national. Detective Sarah Collins, who inherited Candy's case in 1995, regularly submitted the DNA profile to new database systems as they came online. Each submission carried the hope that advances in technology and growing databases would finally identify the killer. The National DNA Index System launched in 1998, allowing comparison of DNA profiles across all 50 states. Detective Collins immediately submitted Candy's case profile, knowing that her killer might have committed crimes in any state following his attack on Candy in 1959. Still, no matches were found. The lack of hits suggested several possibilities. The killer had died before committing other crimes, had successfully avoided prosecution for subsequent crimes, or had moved to a country outside the U.S. database system. Each possibility was frustrating in its own way. Detective Collins maintained regular contact with Mrs. Rogers, now in her 80s but still sharp and determined. Their phone conversations had become as much about providing comfort as sharing information. Mrs. Rogers' faith sustained her through the endless waiting, but her body was beginning to show the strain of carrying grief for 4 decades. "I know God will reveal the truth in His time," Mrs. Rogers told Detective Collins during one of their conversations. I just pray I live long enough to see it. The detective assured her that the case remained active and that new database expansions occurred regularly. Science was advancing rapidly, and techniques that hadn't existed even 10 years earlier were now standard tools. The DNA profile that had seemed revolutionary in the 1,980 seconds was now just one of many technological approaches to solving cold cases. Detective Collins also reached out to other law enforcement agencies, sharing Candy's case information with cold case units across the Pacific Northwest. Regional cooperation was improving, and investigators were beginning to recognize patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. The case file had grown to include computer disks alongside the paper records, reflecting the digital transition in law enforcement. But regardless of storage medium, the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. They had a perfect genetic profile of the killer, but no suspect to compare it against. The new millennium brought unprecedented expansion in DNA database technology and forensic genealogy techniques. Detective Collins, now the senior investigator on Spokane's cold case unit, watched with interest as other departments solved decades-old murders using innovative approaches that combined traditional investigation with genetic genealogy. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of waiting for a direct database match with a known criminal, investigators could upload crime scene DNA to public genealogy websites, building family trees that led from unknown perpetrators to their living relatives. The technique had solved several high-profile cases, including the Golden State Killer murders in California. In 2020, Detective Collins partnered with Michael Hansen, a forensic genealogist who specialized in cold case investigations. Hansen's company had solved more than 50 cold cases nationwide using genetic genealogy techniques, and he was eager to apply his methods to Candy Rogers' murder. The DNA profile from your case is excellent quality, Hansen explained during their initial consultation. It's more than sufficient for genealogy analysis. We just need to upload it to the public databases and start building the family tree. The process began with uploading Candy's killer's DNA profile to genealogy websites like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, where millions of users had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to learn about their ancestry. The hope was that one of these users would share enough DNA with the killer to serve as a starting point for building his family tree. Within weeks, Hansen had identified several potential relatives of the killer, distant cousins who shared small but significant amounts of DNA with the crime scene profile. Using publicly available records, he began constructing family trees that might lead to the killer's identity. The work was painstaking and required extensive research into birth records, marriage certificates, military service records, and obituaries. Each branch of the family tree had to be carefully verified and documented. Hansen worked methodically, following genetic breadcrumbs that led deeper into the past. Detective Collins provided law enforcement resources to verify Hansen's genealogical research, using official databases and investigative techniques to confirm the relationships and timelines that Hansen discovered through public records. After 6 months of intensive genealogical research, Hansen narrowed his focus to a specific family line that showed the strongest genetic connection to the crime scene DNA. The trail led to a family named Hoff, with roots in the Pacific Northwest dating back to the early 1900 seconds. Hansen's research identified John Ray Hoff as the most likely suspect. Born in 1938, Hoff would have been 21 years old at the time of Candy Rogers' murder. More significantly, military records showed that he had been stationed at Fairchild Air Force Base from January 1958 to July 1959, placing him in Spokane during the exact time period of the murder. Detective Collins felt her pulse quicken as she reviewed Hansen's findings. After 62 years, they finally had a name and a face to attach to their DNA profile. But there was a complication. John Ray Hoff had died by suicide in 1970, 11 years after Candy's murder. He can never be prosecuted, Detective Collins explained to her supervisor, but we can finally give the family closure. We can tell them who killed their daughter. Further investigation into Hoff's background revealed a pattern of violence and instability that supported his identification as Candy's killer. Military disciplinary records showed multiple incidents of assault and insubordination. After his discharge from the Air Force, he had been arrested several times for violent crimes, though he had never served significant prison time. Detective Collins worked with Hansen to obtain DNA samples from Hoff's living relatives, seeking definitive confirmation of the genealogical match. The process required careful legal navigation, as obtaining DNA from unwilling relatives could complicate any future legal proceedings. Fortunately, 2 of Hoff's nephews agreed to provide voluntary DNA samples after learning about the investigation. They had grown up hearing family whispers about their uncle's troubled past and violent tendencies. Neither was surprised to learn of his potential involvement in a child's murder. The laboratory comparison took several weeks, but the results were conclusive. The DNA from Hoff's relatives confirmed the genealogical analysis with scientific certainty. John Ray Hoff was Candy Rogers' killer. Detective Collins stared at the final report, feeling a mixture of triumph and sadness. After 62 years, they had solved Spokane's most notorious cold case. But justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible. Hoff had escaped earthly punishment by taking his own life 31 years earlier. The case file that had begun with handwritten notes and black and white photographs now concluded with sophisticated DNA analysis and genealogical research. Technology had finally achieved what decades of traditional investigation could not. On a cool October morning in 2021, Detective Collins drove to the modest home where Mrs. Rogers, now 93, lived with her nephew's family. The detective carried a folder containing the final DNA report and Hansen's genealogical analysis, the proof that would finally answer the question that had haunted this family for more than 6 decades. Mrs. Rogers sat in her favorite chair, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes still bright despite her advanced age. She had outlived her husband by 15 years, sustained by her faith and her determination to see justice for her daughter. Mrs. Rogers, Detective Collins began gently, "We've identified the man who killed Candy." The elderly woman's breath caught, and tears immediately filled her eyes. "After all these years," she whispered. "Tell me," Detective Collins explained the genealogical investigation carefully, describing how DNA technology had finally succeeded where traditional investigation had failed. She showed Mrs. Rogers a photograph of John Ray Hoff in his Air Force uniform, the face of the man who had destroyed their family's happiness. "He was stationed at Fairchild when Candy was killed," Detective Collins explained. "He had a history of violence, and he took his own life in 1970. He'll never face trial, but we know with absolute certainty that he was responsible." Mrs. Rogers stared at Hoff's photograph for a long time, studying the face of the man who had haunted her nightmares for more than 60 years. "He was so young," she said finally. "Just a boy himself, really. What makes someone do such a terrible thing?" The detective had no answer for that question, one that had puzzled investigators and psychologists for generations. Some evils simply couldn't be explained or understood. "Thank you," Mrs. Rogers said, her voice stronger now. "Thank you for never giving up on my little girl. I always believed this day would come. I had faith that God would reveal the truth." Family members gathered around Mrs. Rogers as Detective Collins shared the details of the investigation. There were tears, but also a sense of relief that bordered on joy. The wondering was finally over. The Spokane community learned of the breakthrough through carefully coordinated media releases. Detective Collins and the police department wanted to ensure that Mrs. Rogers and her family heard the news first, before it became public knowledge. Local news stations led their evening broadcasts with the story, 6 two-year-old murder case solved through DNA. The headline captured the community's attention in ways that few stories could. 3 generations of Spokane residents had grown up with Candy Rogers' unsolved murder as part of their city's identity. Reporters interviewed elderly residents who remembered the original search, the funeral, and the years of wondering who among them might be a killer. Many expressed relief that the mystery had finally been solved, even though the resolution brought no traditional justice. "We always wondered," said Evelyn Carter, now 85 and one of the few surviving members of the original search party. "Every time we saw a stranger in town, every time something felt wrong, we thought about that little girl. Now we know it wasn't one of our neighbors. It was a soldier we never suspected." The revelation that Hoff had been a serviceman stationed at Fairchild generated particular interest. Military personnel had been questioned extensively in 1959, but Hoff had apparently avoided suspicion at the time. His ability to blend into the large population of young airmen had provided perfect camouflage. Captain Porter, the Air Force liaison who had coordinated military involvement in the original search, had died years earlier, but his family expressed gratitude that the case had been solved. The shadow of suspicion that had hung over Fairchild Air Force Base personnel for decades was finally lifted. The story attracted national attention, particularly from true crime media outlets that specialized in cold case investigations. Candy Rogers' murder became a symbol of how persistence and advancing technology could achieve justice even after seemingly impossible delays. Detective Collins found herself fielding calls from other law enforcement agencies interested in applying similar techniques to their own cold cases. The success in Spokane offered hope to families across the country who continued waiting for answers. At Mount Olive Cemetery, Mrs. Rogers knelt beside her daughter's grave one more time, carrying a box of Campfire Girl mints and a heavy heart filled with both sorrow and peace. This annual ritual, maintained for 62 years, would be different than all the others. "We know who he was, sweetheart," she whispered to the headstone. His name was John Ray Hoff, and he can't hurt anyone else now. Detective Collins says the science proves it beyond any doubt. The mint box she placed on the grave was identical to thousands of others she had left over the decades, but its meaning had changed. Where previous boxes had represented hope and determination, this one symbolized closure and vindication. Mrs. Rogers spoke aloud about her faith, how it had sustained her through the darkest years when answers seemed impossible. "I always believed God would reveal the truth," she said. "I just never imagined it would take so long, or that the answer would come through science I couldn't even understand." She reflected on the changes she had witnessed, the evolution of Spokane from a small town where children played safely to a modern city where such innocence seemed impossible. Candy's murder had been among the first cracks in that innocence, a harbinger of the more complex world that was coming. "Your daddy would be so relieved," Mrs. Rogers continued. "He carried the guilt of letting you go out that evening until the day he died. Now we know it wouldn't have mattered. That man was hunting, and he would have found you somehow." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering all the developments of the past year and the strange comfort of finally knowing the truth. When Mrs. Rogers finally rose to leave, her movements were slow but somehow lighter than they had been in decades. As she walked back to her nephew's car, she turned for one last look at Candy's grave. "Rest in peace, my darling girl," she called softly. Justice took 62 years, but it finally came. Spokane organized a community memorial walk in Candy Rogers' honor, recognizing both her memory and the persistence that had finally brought justice. Hundreds of residents gathered on a Saturday evening in November, carrying candles and small boxes of mints as symbols of remembrance. The route began at the church where Candy's funeral had been held and wound through the neighborhood where she had lived and died. Participants walked silently for the most part, though some shared memories and stories about how her case had affected their families over the decades. Children who had never heard of Candy Rogers learned her story during the walk, understanding for the first time why their grandparents still locked doors and worried about strangers. The memorial became an intergenerational conversation about safety, trust, and the importance of never forgetting victims of violence. Detective Collins walked with Mrs. Rogers, supporting the elderly woman as she made the journey through neighborhoods that had changed dramatically since 1959. New houses stood where vacant lots had been searched. Modern streetlights illuminated areas that had been dark and dangerous 60 years earlier. At the site where Candy's body had been found, now part of a small park, the walkers gathered in a circle. Reverend Michael Hayes, the current pastor at Mount Olive Baptist Church, offered a prayer for Candy's soul and for all families still waiting for justice in unsolved cases. The candles created a warm glow in the November darkness, their light reflecting off the faces of people united by shared memory and collective healing. Children held their mint boxes carefully, understanding that they represented something precious and fragile. "Tonight we remember not just Candy Rogers, but all the children whose lives have been cut short by violence," Reverend Hayes said. "We remember, and we promise to protect those who remain." The memorial walk became an annual tradition, ensuring that Candy's story would continue to be told to future generations who never knew the fear and uncertainty her murder had brought to Spokane. In law enforcement circles across the country, Candy Rogers' case became a teaching example of how patience, persistence, and evolving technology could solve even the coldest cases. Detective Collins found herself speaking at conferences about the investigation, sharing lessons learned during the 62-year journey to justice. The case highlighted both the limitations and the promise of forensic science. Evidence carefully preserved in 1959 had finally yielded answers in 2021, but only because investigators had maintained hope and continued applying new techniques as they became available. Other families contacted the Spokane Police Department, hoping that their own cold cases might benefit from similar attention. Detective Collins and her team reviewed dozens of old files, looking for cases where DNA evidence might still exist and genealogical investigation might prove fruitful. The success in solving Candy's murder led to increased funding for cold case investigations in Spokane and other Washington state jurisdictions. Politicians and police administrators recognized the public relations value of solving high-profile old cases, but more importantly, they understood the moral obligation to provide closure for grieving families. Michael Hansen's genealogical company received numerous requests from law enforcement agencies seeking similar services. The Candy Rogers case had demonstrated the power of combining traditional detective work with cutting-edge genetic research. Law schools began including the case in courses about criminal justice and forensic science, using it to illustrate how patience and scientific advancement could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The case became a symbol of hope for prosecutors and investigators working on other long-dormant files. Detective Collins often reflected on the irony that John Ray Hoff had escaped human justice by taking his own life, but had ultimately been exposed by the very science he could never have imagined. His DNA, preserved unknowingly for decades, had become the instrument of his identification. Mrs. Rogers passed away peacefully in her sleep on the 15th of March 2022, just 9 days after the 63rd anniversary of her daughter's murder. Her nephew found her in her favorite chair, her hands folded over a photograph of 9-year-old Candy in her campfire girl uniform. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including many who had never met Mrs. Rogers personally but who had been moved by her decades-long vigil for justice. Detective Collins served as an honorary pallbearer, representing the law enforcement officers who had worked on Candy's case over the years. Reverend Hayes delivered a eulogy that celebrated Mrs. Rogers' unwavering faith and determination. "She never gave up hope," he said. "Even in the darkest years, when it seemed impossible that answers would ever come, she maintained her belief that truth would eventually prevail." The service included readings from letters Mrs. Rogers had received from other families dealing with unsolved crimes. Her story had become a source of inspiration for people facing similar tragedies, proof that persistence and faith could sustain hope even through decades of uncertainty. Mrs. Rogers was buried next to her husband, with Candy's grave just a few feet away. The three family members were finally reunited, their headstones forming a small cluster in the peaceful cemetery where so many annual pilgrimages had taken place. Detective Collins placed a final box of campfire girl mints on Mrs. Rogers' grave, continuing the tradition that had defined the elderly woman's relationship with her daughter's memory. The ritual had passed from mother to detective, ensuring that Candy would never be forgotten. As mourners dispersed, many paused at Candy's grave to pay their respects. Her headstone had been updated with a simple addition, "Justice Found 2021. The words were small, but they represented the triumph of a mother's love over time, silence, and death itself. The small park near Fort George Wright, where Candy Rogers' body had been discovered in 1959, became the site of a permanent memorial in her honor. The Spokane City Council voted unanimously to install a bronze plaque and a bench where visitors could sit quietly and remember the 9-year-old whose death had changed their community forever. The dedication ceremony attracted many of the same people who had participated in the memorial walk the previous year. Detective Collins spoke about the importance of remembering victims of violence, not just as statistics or case numbers, but as real people whose lives had meaning and value. The memorial bench faced east, toward the sunrise, symbolizing hope and renewal. The bronze plaque bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Candace Rogers, 1949 to 1959. May her light continue to shine and may justice always prevail." Children from local elementary schools visited the memorial as part of educational programs about community, safety, and history. Teachers used Candy's story to discuss important concepts like stranger danger and the value of reporting suspicious activity to trusted adults. The mint boxes that had once represented Candy's innocent entrepreneurship became symbols of childhood dreams and community protection. Local campfire groups adopted the tradition of leaving mint boxes at the memorial during their annual ceremonies. Detective Collins often brought visiting law enforcement officers to see the memorial, using it as a tangible reminder of why cold case work mattered so much. The bench became a place for quiet reflection about the human cost of unsolved crimes and the persistence required to seek justice. Years passed, but the memorial remained carefully maintained by city workers who understood its significance. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by anonymous visitors who wanted to ensure that Candy Rogers would never be forgotten by her community. The Candy Rogers case became a cornerstone of the Spokane Police Department's cold case training program, taught to new detectives as an example of how patience, scientific advancement, and community support could combine to solve even the most challenging investigations. Detective Collins, now nearing retirement, often lectured at the police academy about the lessons learned during the 62-year investigation. She emphasized the importance of preserving evidence carefully, maintaining hope despite setbacks, and embracing new technologies as they became available. The case files, now digitized and carefully archived, served as a comprehensive record of how criminal investigation techniques had evolved from 1959 to 2021. Students could trace the progression from handwritten notes and black and white photographs to DNA analysis and genealogical research. Other law enforcement agencies sent representatives to Spokane to study the Rogers case methodology. The successful combination of traditional detective work and cutting-edge science became a model for cold case units across the country. Michael Hansen's forensic genealogy company expanded significantly after the Rogers case success, taking on dozens of similar investigations for departments that had previously considered their cold cases unsolvable. The techniques pioneered in Spokane spread throughout the law enforcement community. Detective Collins established a scholarship fund in Mrs. Rogers's name, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in forensic science and criminal justice. The scholarship ensured that Candy's story would continue to inspire new generations of investigators and scientists. The case also contributed to legislative changes regarding evidence preservation requirements and funding for cold case investigations. Lawmakers recognized that advancing technology could breathe new life into old cases, but only if evidence had been properly maintained over the decades. On a quiet spring morning in 2024, Detective Collins made her final visit to Candy Rogers's grave before retiring from the Spokane Police Department. She carried a box of Campfire Girl mints and a letter she had written to the 9-year-old who had shaped her career in ways she never could have imagined. "Dear Candy," she read aloud, "I'm retiring today after 30 years of police work, and I wanted you to know that your case taught me everything important about being a detective. You taught me that every victim matters, that families deserve answers, and that justice is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes." The cemetery was peaceful in the early morning light, with dew still glistening on the grass around the headstones. Detective Collins had visited this grave dozens of times over the years, but this farewell felt especially significant. "Your mother was an incredible woman," she continued. "Her faith and determination inspired everyone who worked on your case. She never gave up, and because of that, we never gave up either. She lived to see justice done, and I think that brought her more peace than she ever expected." Detective Collins placed the mint box carefully at the base of the headstone, maintaining the tradition that Mrs. Rogers had started 65 years earlier. The ritual had become sacred to everyone who had worked on Candy's case. "I hope you're with your parents now," she whispered. "I hope you know that you were loved, that you were never forgotten, and that your story helped protect other children." That's a pretty amazing legacy for someone who only lived 9 years. As she walked back to her car, Detective Collins felt a sense of completion that few police officers ever experience. They had solved the case, provided closure for the family, and ensured that Candy Rogers would be remembered as more than just a victim. She would be remembered as a symbol of hope,